He happens to be a gentleman, Ralph, and that seems to be something that you have forgotten all about. He treats us like women. That's something you've forgotten too, Ralph. You seem to have forgotten that I am a woman.
There's a moment in live television that you cannot take back. No editing room, no second take, no quiet phone call to a producer can erase what 60 million people witnessed in real time. And in the autumn of 1956, on a Friday night that started like any other, one of the most beloved comedies in American television history crossed a line so thin, so invisible, that nobody in that studio even realized it had happened until the silence hit. Not the comfortable silence of a punchline landing, not the kind of pause an audience holds before erupting into laughter. This was the other kind of silence, the kind that makes the people holding clipboards backstage stop moving, the kind that travels through a television screen and settles cold and strange into a living room. That silence, lasting only a few seconds, set into motion a chain of events that would end the Honeymooners as the world knew it. And for decades, nobody talked about why. To understand what happened that night, you have to go back further than 1956. You have to go back to a Brooklyn kid who had nothing and decided to turn that nothing into something the whole country would recognize. Jackie Gleason was born in 1916 in the Bushwick neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. His childhood was not the kind that produces comfortable men. His father walked out when Jackie was 9 years old, vanishing so completely that the family had no idea whether he was alive or dead for years. His mother, May, worked herself to exhaustion just to keep a roof over their heads, and she died when Jackie was still a teenager. He dropped out of school, learned to hustle pool, worked odd jobs, and found that the one thing he could always do, the thing that came as naturally as breathing, was make people laugh. He could read a room the way other people read a book, sensing what it needed, and then delivering it before anyone even knew they wanted it. By the late 1940s, Gleason had worked his way through nightclubs, vaudeville stages, and bit parts in films. He was funny, he was magnetic, and he was enormously talented, but he had not yet found the role that would define him. That changed when he landed on the Dumont Network's cavalcade of stars in 1950. It was there, in front of a live studio audience, that he first introduced a character named Ralph Cramden, a New York City bus driver with a barrel chest, an explosive temper, and dreams that were always 3 sizes too big for his circumstances. The character was rough, impulsive, and loud. He was nothing like the wise, pipe-smoking television fathers that dominated the airwaves at the time, and audiences fell in love with him immediately. Ralph was not aspirational in the traditional sense. He did not live in a well-decorated home with a manicured lawn. He lived in a sparse, worn-down apartment in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn. There was no refrigerator in that kitchen, just a standing icebox. The furniture was functional at best. The wallpaper looked like it had been arguing with moisture for 20 years. But that cramped apartment was not a symbol of failure. It was a symbol of reality. And reality, it turned out, was something that millions of American television viewers were hungry to see reflected back at them. When CBS picked up The Honeymooners as its own standalone series in 1955, the show's format was deceptively simple. Each episode was a self-contained story. Ralph would hatch some grand scheme to escape his working-class circumstances, a get-rich-quick plan, a chance at fame, an opportunity he was absolutely certain would change everything, and by the end of 30 minutes, the plan would have collapsed spectacularly, and Ralph would be left right where he started, but somehow warmer for having learned something along the way. The formula sounds predictable on paper. On screen, it was electric. A huge part of what made the show work was Alice Cramden, Ralph's wife, a woman who refused to be a prop in her own marriage. Alice was sharp, grounded, and completely unintimidated by her husband's bluster. While every other sitcom wife of that era seemed to exist primarily to validate her husband's decisions, Alice pushed back. She called Ralph out. She saw through his schemes long before they collapsed, said so clearly, and then stood beside him anyway when they did. That dynamic, two people who genuinely irritated each other and genuinely loved each other at the same time, was something audiences had not seen on television before. It felt honest in a medium that had not been known for honesty. The role of Alice, however, had not always belonged to the actress who made it famous. In the early cavalcade of stars days, Alice Cramden was played by Pert Kelton, a veteran actress with a sharp comic energy that matched Gleason's intensity almost blow for blow. Kelton's version of Alice was scrappier, quicker to raise her voice, and brought a raw edge to the domestic sparring that suited the rough early sketches. And then, without any public announcement, she was gone. The official explanation offered to anyone who asked was vague. Health reasons, the network said, with the particular blandness that the 1950s television industry had perfected for situations it did not want examined too closely. The real circumstances were more complicated and more troubling. This was the era of the Red Scare, a period of intense national anxiety about communist influence in American institutions. The entertainment industry was one of the hardest hit. Congressional investigations, public accusations, and industry blacklists had already destroyed the careers of writers, directors, and performers who were either suspected of communist sympathies or simply had the bad luck of being connected, however tenuously, to someone who was. Kelton's husband had come under scrutiny during this period, and in an atmosphere where then the suggestion of guilt by association could be fatal to a career, CBS made a quiet business decision. Kelton was out. No fanfare, no acknowledgement, no explanation that reflected the actual reason. She simply disappeared from the show. Replacing her was a far more difficult task than the network anticipated. Alice Cramden was not a supporting role. She was the structural counterweight to Ralph's volatility, and getting the balance wrong would have unraveled the entire show. CBS executives held auditions, and when Audrey Meadows walked in, they were skeptical. She was, they felt, too polished, too conventionally attractive to be believable as a working-class Brooklyn wife. Meadows understood the objection perfectly, and rather than argue against it, she showed up to her follow-up meeting having deliberately presented herself exactly as Alice would look on an ordinary Tuesday morning. No glamour, no Hollywood styling, just a woman who looked like she had a household to run and not enough hours to run it in. Gleason looked at those photographs and knew instantly she was right for the part. What Meadows brought to the role was something subtly different from what Kelton had offered, and that difference mattered enormously. Where Kelton had matched Ralph's fire with fire, Meadows played Alice with a quieter form of strength. She let Ralph exhaust himself. She waited, and then, when he had run out of steam, she delivered the line that would undo him completely, calmly, without raising her voice, with the particular devastation that only genuine confidence can produce. The result was a different kind of comedy, one where Ralph's enormity made Alice's stillness funnier, and Alice's stillness made Ralph's enormity more human. The show ran live every Friday night, and that liveness was inseparable from its power. There was no safety net. Whatever happened in front of that studio audience was what 60 million people at home were going to see. Gleason thrived under those conditions. He had spent years performing in rooms where you either got the crowd or you didn't, where there was no second chance and no retouching. He treated each episode the way a stage actor treats opening night, with total commitment, total presence, and a willingness to improvise when the moment called for it. That improvisational energy was part of what made the show feel alive in a way that filmed, edited, carefully controlled sitcoms simply could not replicate. But liveness also meant that anything could happen. And in October of 1956, something did. The episode was called The Deciding Vote. On paper, it was classic Honeymooners territory. Ralph becomes convinced that his single vote will determine the outcome of a local election, and the premise spirals through misunderstandings and self-inflicted complications in the way that only Ralph Cramden's certainties ever did. For most of the episode, everything went as it always did. Gleason was in command of the room, feeding off the audience's energy, finding the rhythms of the material with the instinct that had made him one of the most skilled live performers of his generation. And then came the moment. During a heated exchange with Alice, Gleason delivered the line that had become the show's most recognizable recurring joke, the threat that Ralph always made and never meant, the one that audiences had learned to anticipate as the cue that his frustration had reached its peak. He had said it dozens of times before. It had always landed as comedy, because everything in Ralph's delivery told you it was comedy. The exaggeration, the theatrical fury, the fact that the audience understood instinctively that Ralph Cramden was a man who loved his wife even when she made him want to walk into traffic. This time was different. Something in Gleason's performance in that moment shifted into a register that the line had never occupied before. The delivery was quieter, more controlled. The theatricality was gone. What remained was something that did not have the shape or texture of a joke, and the studio audience felt it immediately. The laughter did not come. The silence that followed was not the silence of an audience that had missed the punchline. It was the silence of an audience that was genuinely uncertain about what it had just witnessed. Backstage, crew members who had been through hundreds of live broadcasts later described stopping mid-task when the audience went quiet. Something about the stillness communicated itself instantly, even to people who could not see the stage. When the broadcast continued and eventually ended, the jokes that followed did land, the episode concluded, and on the surface everything seemed fine. But the damage had been done in a medium where perception is its own reality. The response came quickly, though not publicly. Letters arrived at CBS, not the usual mix of fan mail and light criticism, but letters from viewers who described the moment as unsettling, who used words like uncomfortable and wrong to describe what they had seen. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, conversations that had already been brewing between network executives and the show's sponsors became more urgent. The Honeymooners had always walked a line. Its working-class grit, its sharp marital arguments, its lack of the wholesome resolution that other sitcoms provided. These qualities had always made some advertisers nervous even as they attracted audiences. What happened in the deciding vote gave those nervous advertisers a specific incident to point to. One major sponsor made its position clear. The show needed to pull back from moments like that, or their financial support would not continue. In the economics of 1950s network television, a sponsor making that kind of statement was not the beginning of a negotiation. It was the end of one. CBS began private discussions about the show's future, and those discussions did not take long to reach a conclusion. There was no farewell episode, no final broadcast where the audience could say, "Why goodbye to Ralph and Alice and Ed Norton," the lovable upstairs neighbor played by Art Carney, whose deadpan delivery and physical comedy had made him the perfect complement to Gleason's volatility. One week the show was there, the next week it was not. To the viewing public, the end was a mystery. To everyone inside the industry, it was understood, if never officially acknowledged. For Gleason, the cancellation was personal in a way that professional setbacks rarely are. Ralph Cramden was not just a character he played. Ralph was assembled from the specific materials of Gleason's own life, the Brooklyn streets, the financial insecurity, the enormous frustrated ambition of a man who knows he is capable of more than his circumstances have allowed. Losing the show meant losing the vessel that had allowed him to externalize all of that, to transform private pain into public comedy. He took it hard. In a move that was unusual for the era, Gleason negotiated to buy back the rights to the Honeymooners from CBS, ensuring that Ralph and Alice and Norton would remain his to do with as he chose. Over the following 2 decades, he brought the characters back periodically in sketches on his variety programs, and later in a full revival filmed in Miami in the 1960s. The chemistry was still there in flashes. The laugh still came. But something essential had changed: the liveness, the urgency, the sense that anything could happen and everyone in the room knew it. And without that, the Miami episodes felt like a fond recreation of something rather than the thing itself. What is remarkable, looking back, is how completely the show transcended the circumstances of its ending. The original 39 episodes, the ones recorded during that single 1955 to 56 season, became one of the most enduring bodies of work in American television history. When local stations began airing them in reruns throughout the 1960s and 1970s, new generations of viewers discovered Ralph and Alice for the first time, and found in them something that the glossier, safer sitcoms of subsequent years had not managed to provide: the working-class setting, the economic anxiety, the flawed characters who loved each other imperfectly and out loud. These qualities did not date. If anything, they became more valuable as television grew more polished and more careful. The influence of the Honeymooners on American situation comedy is difficult to overstate. The creative DNA of shows like All in the Family, which brought working-class discomfort back to prime time in the 1970s, runs directly through Ralph Cramden's frustrated roar. The Connor family of Roseanne, navigating a world of financial strain and genuine marital friction in the late 1980s and 1990s, owes a debt to the template that Gleason and Meadows established. Even animated characters, Fred Flintstone, Homer Simpson, carry the genetic imprint of Ralph Cramden. Big men with big feelings and a persistent, touching inability to be the version of themselves they imagine themselves to be. The line that ended the original run of the Honeymooners was not a scandal in the conventional sense. Nobody was arrested. Nobody admitted wrongdoing. Nothing was hidden that would look, in retrospect, like a crime or a conspiracy. What happened was more subtle and in some ways more interesting. A single live moment in which a comedy, by accident or instinct or some combination of both, showed the audience something slightly too real, and the audience, trained by years of television to expect a certain kind of reality, did not know what to do with it. Television in the 1950s was built on reassurance. Its job was to make Americans feel that the world was orderly and manageable and fundamentally warm. The Honeymooners had always pushed against that, but it had pushed in ways that were packaged safely inside comedy. The moment in the deciding vote slipped outside that packaging, just for a few seconds, just long enough for the studio to go quiet and the letters to start arriving. And in an industry where the difference between a hit show and a canceled show could hinge on the nervousness of a single sponsor, a few seconds was enough. What Jackie Gleason built in those 39 episodes was something that television has spent the 7 decades since trying to recreate. The feeling of watching real people in real circumstances navigate real emotions, with enough humor to make the difficulty bearable and enough honesty to make the humor matter. The show ended not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded too completely, had gotten too close to something true at a moment when truth was more than its network was willing to broadcast. The silence that fell over that studio in October 1956 lasted only a few seconds. The conversation it started has never really ended.